My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. We have a good one today that involves some of my favorite animals on the planet. We have Mark Lauderhand, who has been photographing and videoing and putting together books and creating all types of media around reptiles, amphibians, nature, but in particular snakes. And he's got a great deal of experience working with timber rattlesnakes, which you all know are also one of my favorite animals on the planet. And so I'm excited for this conversation. I think I've probably been looking at Mark's photos and trail cam videos for years, but I think when I first took note was one of his more popular videos that really made the rounds, and we'll talk about that, so I won't get into it, but it was kind of a really interesting predation documentation in timber rattlesnakes. But we'll get to that because it's a pretty exciting video. So welcome to the podcast, Mark. How are you doing today?
I am doing fine. I appreciate this opportunity, and thanks for having me on. Hopefully I can add some more interesting insight to already a fascinating reptile.
Yeah, great. Well, I like to start at the beginning, meaning I like to figure out how my guests ended up getting into snakes, because it's very normal for us to go out and work with them or spend a Saturday out looking for these animals. But for most people, it's way outside of their box of normal. So I like to learn how that happened. Is this something that kind of bit you when you were younger, as a child? Well, is this something that hit you more recently?
I think with a lot of reptile enthusiasts, they will say that it started in childhood, and I'll go back even further. I think you're born with it. Mm-hmm. Not everyone, but there really is no explanation outside of, well, I appreciate the natural world, I like going hiking, which a lot of people do. But yet a lot of these same folks have a fear of snakes or reptiles in general. It's just, I was young, and the first green frog I caught in a pond led to the first garter snake. And could things get any better than that? Well, then you get Blanding's turtles, and then you work your way up eventually to our local pit vipers here in New England, the eastern copperhead and the timber rattlesnake. But without going too much on a tangent there, it really opened up my appreciation for the entire natural world. So it was a gateway, so to speak, into appreciating the flora and fauna in the Northeast and beyond. And as an adult, how this can lead to conservation of the natural world. So I suppose some folks, it's in reverse. Well, they like birding or they like whale watching, and then they start to appreciate, how does this all connect in the ecosystem? And then eventually they reach a point, well, I'm not a fan of snakes, but I appreciate any integral role they play. So it's how you get there, I guess, with snakes. Some people, even that appreciate the natural world, will never really appreciate snakes. But I think it is still a conduit to getting there. So in a nutshell, it was just there shortly after I could speak as a toddler, a fascination. And I hope that kind of sums it up. And I know a lot of people listening to this probably experienced the same route. Other people, we're all different, of course. Sometimes I've met, on many occasions, people in their 20s and 30s that kind of went in reverse, appreciated the natural world. And I get a lot of responses from people that, I've never seen a timber rattlesnake. I would love to see one someday, just to get a photograph. So it's by degrees. And a lot of people that are reptile enthusiasts, it becomes an obsession, unavoidable obsession once you really start going down that road. For some people, it's breeders, it's captivity. For a lot of other so-called herpers, I'm not a big fan of that term, but it's unavoidable. It's the field research, whether it's amateur field research or making a career out of it. I've sort of been in kind of on the periphery of all of that, working with state officials, state biologists, hanging out with 19-year-old, kids to 78, 80-year-old old-timers. And it's an eclectic group of people sometimes, but it makes life interesting. And it keeps me young, or at least I pretend so.
I like that. So green frogs are the gateway drug to the bigger things out there. And so for our audience, there are many parts of the eastern U.S., even parts of the western U.S. where timber rattlesnakes are. I don't know if I'd call them common anywhere, but they're much more common. And having grown up in New England myself, people should realize, like you were saying, like timber rattlesnakes in the Northeast are like the pinnacle of snakes. They're like, something like in the Southeast, you might think of like an indigo snake or whatever it might be in other parts of the country. But timber rattlesnakes, and it's also worth mentioning that they're arguably one of the most threatened and endangered vertebrate in many of the northeastern states as well. So, again, we'll talk a lot about timber rattlesnakes today. So you grew up in New England, grew up in Massachusetts, I'm assuming?
I grew up in southern New Hampshire, primarily Londonderry, New Hampshire, attended the University of New Hampshire, where I met my current wife, and we moved to Massachusetts. And being so close to New Hampshire, and that's where a lot of my family is, there's really no state boundary for me between, especially northeastern Massachusetts and southeastern New Hampshire. So a lot of my time out in the field is mostly in Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire. And we'll get a little bit more into this, but I'm trying to find new populations of the New Hampshire timber rattlesnake, and there's only one known population. So you had just mentioned a few moments ago how endangered they are. Well, the state of New Hampshire Fish and Game has come up with a new designation, critically imperiled. So that's another way of just saying they're biologically extinct. And if there are other dens, they're probably not near the one extant den. So it's dire. But
it
I
really
think is. And when you were mentioning that they are common, and certainly I visit areas where the populations are stable, healthy, perhaps even growing in New York. And I'm often asked by, we'll call them non-snake relatives, like when you come across whatever the 1,000th encounter with a timber rattlesnake, or whatever number of males, females, hundreds of or thousands of babies over the year, like what is there an end point to the fascination? And to extend that further, seeing a timber rattlesnake in captivity, it's a timber rattlesnake. I've seen, thousands of encounters, or the ones in the wild. So why continue to go out there? What else can you learn and observe? And I think that because the timber rattlesnake's life history is just so intriguing, and in some of these areas where they are, we'll just say common, you're learning more because you're encountering more of these animals. There's more data points, so to speak. So finding a snake at a certain location, at a certain date, certain weather conditions, it's always a little different in many cases. It's tweaked here or there. And just when you think after 5, 7, 10, 20 years of doing this, and oh, I've never encountered a rattlesnake or this many rattlesnakes in November on this particular date, and or this birthing rookery is further than any other birthing rookery I have encountered, or this den site is a lot closer to the adjacent den site, closer than it's explained in literature. So it's the learning curve is many lifetimes long, and I've expanded with that with trail cameras. I guess we'll eventually be talking about the weasel, long-tailed weasel predation I've been recording inadvertently and by mistake, which I guess that's how a lot of memorable discoveries are often illuminated. So they're common, but in certain areas, but you can learn so much. And they are predictable to a degree with their birthing rookeries, their ingress, egress routes, basically their migratory routes, their dens. So once you learn the basics, that gets you, once you learn the basics, you can build upon those basics and learn things because they are where they are. In many situations, you expect them to be there. But because you're always visiting and because you're going to areas, again, where they're relatively common, you're just have a chance to learn more. If you're dealing with, like, say, the New Hampshire timber rattlesnakes, it's like I'm starting all over again, just trying to find another snake somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's a spin-off of the whole, obsession with these animals. Like, finding one New Hampshire timber rattlesnake is worth thousands that I'll encounter in the future in New York. It will reset it like it's the first animal again. And it will reset the whole learning process because they're not common in New Hampshire. Yeah. So whether it's a whole different setup there, and you're dealing with the same animal.
Yeah. Another thing I really love about timber rattlesnakes, and then I'm gonna go back a little, but another thing I really love is that I've seen a few situations, but in most situations, timber rattlesnakes live in incredibly beautiful places and wild landscapes, which is something really amazing. But I did want to back up. I want to go back. So you're growing up. You've got this like inherent, it's in your genes kind of interest in reptiles and amphibians and nature, and I'm assuming that just kind of continued throughout your childhood. I'm curious. Well, let me ask you. So I'm curious. I don't believe, and you can tell us what your career trajectory was, but I don't believe that your career is actually focused on working with these animals, your day-to-day job, that is. But how did you maintain that interest and grow that interest, and also the interest in photography and videography? Did that come out of an interest in snakes, or did you have that interest and then you decided, I can apply that to snakes? So basically, how did your career, your interest in snakes, and your interest in, we'll just call it media, how did those all kind of develop in parallel, or did they feed off of one another?
Good question, and it's not a linear one. So I did major in wildlife biology. I got a degree in wildlife biology from UNH, and after college, I was a little burnt out. So my first year I went to University of Maine. I transferred to UNH. And the credit system was different, and the way I was taking courses, and then I wanted to major in a minor, and that just never really happened. So I was in college for 5.5 years, and I was a little bit burnt out. And when we're young, 20s doesn't seem young to some people, but like, I have forever to nail down a career. Just I need some time off. I just want to hike, and at that point I started really nurturing photography, and I had all the time in the world. You know, you're going to be in your 20s forever, right? So my parents never told me that I was going to one day wake up and be 30 and then get married and have kids, which has all been great. So after college, I just, for a few years, had odd jobs. One of my best friends owns a pizza dough business in southern New Hampshire. And actually, I work in southern New Hampshire, so that connection there. And I've been working part-time for him for decades now. And the convenient schedule worked for being a part-time dad when the kids were young. And my wife's the breadwinner, and I am the starving artist, but not really because she's the breadwinner. So post-college, there was a break there before I kind of circled back to so I was always hiking, or I'd always do challenges. Hike Mount Washington, try to hike all the 48 4,000 footers in New Hampshire. So it was always there in the background, but in my 20s, I was living outside Boston. I hate using the word clubbing, but that's what I was doing for a couple of years. And, you know, once I settled down, my wife and I settled down, it was really bad timing where, like, I really want to get back to my childhood fascination with herpetofauna. And it fell squarely on timber rattlesnakes just a few months before my son Bryce was born. And a lot of credit to my wife, her compromising nature, but for many weekends, for many years, not whole weekends, but primarily Sundays when Bryce was young, and then eventually my daughter Eve, born a couple years later, I was just keeping up with that. And then it just went into the deep end for my fascination with timber rattlesnakes. But the healthy populations were nearly round trip 5 hours. So there's many conversations I had with my poor wife, Emily. I will be home by dinner. But I'd find that last one or two rattlesnakes hiking out, get stuck in some traffic on the Mass Pike coming back into Massachusetts, and I'd stroll in the door at 9:30, 10 o'clock, and my excuse at the time, not to get too personal, this is all well in the past, but I'm like, well, I'm a part-time dad most of the week, or half the week, to be fair. I was at home with the kids, and my wife was home on the weekends, so I kind of so that's when my kids were babies and toddlers, is when the inconvenient chapter when I had the least amount of time and latitude, despite Emily's compromising nature. But as the kids got older, and I would bring the kids sometimes, and my wife, it made logistically, it was more better logistically for the family and the traveling and everything else. And even that now was years ago, and the photography, just nurturing the whole photography angle, and finally buying really professional equipment and learning how to use it. And you're mentioning a photography that really, I think, is the core of who I am. And I would have a lot of difficulty going out in nature without at least having my camera strapped, or inside strapped on a backpack. So it's the technology is there, and we'll talk more about this with trail cameras, and I just harness it, and I like to share and document through video and photography and even aerial photography.
So the interest in cameras came from your interest in snakes. So you're seeing these snakes, and so you wanted to develop skills in photography to document.
As a child, I wasn't into photography, although I would cut out pictures from Ranger Rick and hang them all over my wall. No pictures of movie stars or bands or models. It was Ranger Rick, and then eventually National Geographic, and of course this is all pre-internet. And I was the oddball in the neighborhood or in my high school, and to the point where my parents were concerned that I was just never going to get a girlfriend. I was 17 years old. I'd come home stinking of algae, covered in muck, bringing home garter snakes and gravid northern water snakes that would give live birth in a big barrel I kept. So it just kept going on and on and on. So that initially, it was my childhood fascination for reptiles. And then as a teenager, I would be, even though I wasn't proficient in photography or didn't really know anything about f-stop, shutter, so that came afterwards. So they were almost pacing one another for a while, and then photography kind of overtook. I think a lot of people that follow me will be confused why I'll take urban shots a lot of the time, or candid human shots. Again, the core is the natural world, and in the bullseye of that is herpetofauna, but I don't have a specific niche, so to speak, and I just appreciate all types of, especially older historical photos. And I have an interest in history in general. So, and maybe that's a good thing. Like I was mentioning before we started recording, the weather's just terrible today. And then we'll get a lot more of those, and it'll become almost every day throughout the winter months. Every day, I mean getting out in the field and actually seeing reptiles. Although in recent years, you can turn up some of these animals in the middle of winter. But anyway, they always say that to be successful at something, you should really focus on a unique niche. And I think that is true for the most part, but just not with me. Even though, herpetofauna, specifically timber rattlesnakes, it's a core of that. But maybe the obsession all those years ago made me realize that it was taking me away from my family more than it should, even though I was learning a lot. I had to really combine things. Like, why not go for family hikes? Like, oh, mushrooms are colorful and interesting, and that's a good photo topic. So I also got there in not a linear fashion either. And I hope this sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a break to let you know that you can stay connected to the Orianne Society by signing up for our monthly newsletter. Be the first to receive exciting updates on reptile and amphibian conservation, from the latest news and staff blog posts to exclusive announcements like upcoming Snake Talk podcast guests. Go to our website at www.orianne.org and sign up for the newsletter at the bottom of our homepage.
So with the photography specific to the herpetofauna, has there been like a progression or an evolution of like your thought around that, linking those two interests of yours? Meaning, like, maybe you started and it was purely for yourself to, keep track of your memories, and then it evolved into something that's more outward versus inward. Like, has there been a progression of your thoughts with photography and herpetofauna?
It's basically all of the above. As I improved with photography and just racked up the credit cards, buying expensive equipment that I'm probably paying for to the day I die, but it's all worth it. And I used to shoot on analog camera, on film camera. I learned a lot that way because less latitude for making mistakes compared to digital cameras. So the technology has improved. I've become pretty confident in producing good work using this equipment, and this is years and years learning, mostly on my own. And it's capturing an image of we'll just focus on snakes, is I would rather have an image where, in situ, as found, of a garter snake coiled in a pool of autumn sunlight on the forest floor than a 5-foot timber rattlesnake stretched out under a bush with horrible lighting. The encounter is personally, it means something to me. But then a lot of that personal encounter is, can I capture it on film or video? And that is why I sometimes focus on taking images of more common animals, because they're more common, but it increases the chances that they're going to just be in the perfect lighting situation. And for me, I want the goal, again, it's inward, it's personal, but I want other folks to appreciate that image. And I'm a very humble person, so for me, I'm just glad that I'm alive when such technology exists. And I didn't create this lighting situation. I didn't put the snake there. I'm a messenger. Can I capture what I'm seeing right now for the viewer to appreciate it? Yes, of course, it's a lot of training on my part and everything else, but I don't want people to think about that. I want them to appreciate the end result. And over time, it's become monetary now too. So it's a drop in the bucket for all the investment involved. But it's nice in recent years to get some of that back, and of course put it right back in to paying for this equipment or traveling or gas money, whatever it is. Or at least the excuse to tell my wife, see, I'm making a little bit of money now, so this is why I need to go. This is why I need to, whatever, go look for Massasaugas in Ontario or whatever. So there's a lot of engagement over the last few years in some of my social media platforms. But, I never feel awkward about that, or I don't deserve it. Because I'm not a pretentious person. I'm the messenger. And I am seeing something there that is bigger than me. It's, whatever, millions of years of evolution. It's the lighting of the day. It's the sun. It's the shadow or overcast or the fall foliage. And I've just used that knowledge to produce an end product that hopefully a viewer will appreciate. Mm-hmm. So
are you self-taught on both fronts, or have you worked with people, meaning the photography front, but also the animals, meaning like timber rattlesnakes, as you've alluded to, they occur at one site in New Hampshire, they occur really at 2 sites in Vermont, a handful of sites in Mass and Connecticut. You don't just I'm going to go out and shoot a timber rattlesnake tomorrow. So are you kind of self-taught? Did you learn distribution, natural history, and photography?
Yeah, initially, yes. And self-taught, not going on YouTube videos, but research articles, many, many books, and then eventually meeting biologists and conferring with them. Like right now, I'm involved in a really neat hognose pit tag study here in Massachusetts, and we've learned quite a bit. And this is just volunteer work that I'm working through Mass Fish and Game, called Zoo New England, and they do a lot of stuff with Roger Williams Zoo. So it's usually cases like that where I'm not getting, I don't receive a paycheck from the state, but I have worked on the periphery and then again more direct with this really neat hognose study. And regarding photography, no formal classes. I was going to go back to college for photography, just the funds weren't there, and I just learned mostly on my own, in many cases through old school textbooks and starting from scratch. What is an f-stop? What is a shutter? How do they work with one another? And then quickly realizing, wow, I really need to get better equipment, external lenses, and that led to drones and video cameras. And we just live at a really, the last 10, 15, 20 years, the technology, and I'm not technologically savvy at all. Anything wrong with my phone, I need my son to fix it, or even on the computer. So it's just pigeonholed into photography and editing software. Anything out, if something's wrong with the editing software, I need my son to fix it. I'm pigeonholed into that. But being able to utilize some of this technology, which is an irony to use technology to appreciate nature. But, there it is, especially with trail cameras or time-lapse GoPros or aerial photography that I have gotten with basking turtles using drones, basking rattlesnakes using drones, alligators, pronghorns. So it's neat to be able to utilize this technology to share part of the natural world with people that even if they just have a passing interest.
Well, let's stick with the photography before we leave it. I do want to get into some of those other technologies that you mentioned, but I want to get towards, you started talking about how you're starting to make actually a little bit of money and these types of things, but I want to talk about that, so taking these pictures for yourself, for your own memories, to capture moments, but then I want to talk about how your photography has allowed you to do something broader. And I guess we'll start with the book, and then I want to kind of talk about other things. So talk a little bit about your book on pit vipers, kind of like how the idea came together, and maybe a little bit about the process and all of that.
So my book, there's a saying that there's a book in every one of us. And maybe that's true, but the investment of time it will drive you delirious. And it really is true, at least for me and a lot of other writers. You need to lock yourself away. And in the middle of that process, which I'll get into, I understand why some writers just want a cabin in the woods and to just lock yourself away. It isn't about, I'll go home, I'll go to my day job, I'll go to the gym, I'll do other errands, and between 6 and 8, I'll sit down and I'll write every night. Or it's usually, the best is 4 hours. I know like crazy authors like Stephen King can just put in 12-hour days and bang out a book in a month. It's the investment of time even before you sit down to have that mental capacity to really, especially when you're writing factual, in my case, it was storytelling, unique encounters out in the field. Carl Karfeld's Snakes and Snake Hunting, I purposely read that after I wrote my book, and I was just, and then many people had approached me saying that type of writing, and I was just so humbled and blown away. But I purposely didn't read that book until after I wrote mine, because I didn't want any too much overlap or even mimicry of his work. But it took 2 years, and this was my schedule where I was working, or I still am, part-time, and no other distractions like I have now. No real social media, just spending the whole day or parts of a day. And a lot of that, at least for me, would be 45 minutes staring at a screen and haven't wrote a single word, or wrote a couple sentences and then deleted them. But again, authors are different, but I think there's some similarities where once you get going, once you break that hurdle and you get going and you really get into it, that you can finally get something down. And that's the whole process where, and I've heard this too, that you have to write every single day. You can't, not saying it's impossible, but you probably have heard stories, no pun intended, of people trying to write a book, then they take a break, and then they just never get back to it. Like the longer there is a break, the less likelihood, at least in some cases, of buckling back down and really getting into that. And it would get to the point that if whatever I missed a day, it's Christmas, I would start to get an anxiety attack, that I'd get writer's block, and I wouldn't be able to get back into it. And I had noticed that the longer break I took, whether it's holidays, whether I was sick or on vacation, it was more difficult. It would take a couple of days to get back to where I was before, in terms of getting, something on paper, so to speak. And the day I had started, it was just 2 weeks before, I was like, I need to write a book. And it wasn't even a couple of weeks. It was a couple of days. I didn't even think about it. I had stories in my mind, of course. And I just sat down and I didn't stop for 2 years. And it would take me hours just to bang out one page, hours and hours. Of course, I probably had written 2 or 3 or 4 pages, but a lot of that's deletions. And I wanted to share some, well, at least what I thought, interesting encounters. Not, I went out and I saw the most rattlesnakes I've ever seen. Or I wanted to include some human encounters, some even humorous, if not uncomfortable human encounters out in the field. Or just something unique that I've never observed with these animals before. So it wasn't a biology book per se. It wasn't all stories. It was an overlap, an integration of the two. And I've received quite a bit of positive feedback over the years. And
give the title of the book for everybody.
In Search of New England's Pit Vipers.
Great.
Which, of course, in New England, we only have the 2, timber rattlesnakes and copperheads.
Yeah, we'll link it in the show notes so people can find it.
Yeah, it was through Eco Publishing, but it's all over. You can get it on Amazon now. I don't have any more personal copies, but it is neat. Over the years, you just see them being sold in Europe and Africa. I don't even know how many countries. A lot of these, of course, are used copies that have just been passed around. But it's and that was another thing, kind of like college. I was exhausted after the whole writing experience, but that just fueled into more photography and then videography, then producing videos. So one type of content evolved into other types of content. Mm-hmm. Same general topics, of course.
Yeah. Before we leave the book, though, so you mentioned it's a book of stories. You mentioned it's about pit vipers. So talk a little bit about the structure of the book. So is each chapter, say, a story of an adventure you had with a pit viper? How does the book kind of lay out?
Yeah, so for the most part, they're standalone chapters. So you could read any chapter and not feel like you needed to read the preceding chapters. So a couple of them, and again, quote, herpers will appreciate this, is some of their first encounters regarding a species that they've always wanted to see. So one of the chapters is really focused on the year. So for a couple of years, I had maps out. I had like a war room set up where I had all these topographical maps hanging on walls, putting in pins, doing a lot of research for a whole year before I even went out to search in the field for my first rattlesnake. So I discussed that in the buildup of it and what it was like to discover, my first population or my first population of hognose and how it relates to years later and what that means and how it compares to that first encounter. And again, I tell some human stories as well, bumping into people that I should have been bumping into in the Blue Hills. Blue Hills attracts a lot of different types of folks, and All consensual adults, but some areas I'm looking for snakes and I don't want to see that. So I have
You're
one
looking for a
funny
different
encounter when with my poor wife, and I guess I'll just say it. It's not like anything that bad, but we had just seen this gorgeous gravid timber rattlesnake at a birthing rookery, and this is off the main trails, and we're hiking out, and then it's sort of like a animal trail. Some people use it, but it kind of connects to main trails, and we're hiking out, and I just see this naked guy jumping out of the bushes, staring at us, and then jumping away again. I'm like, all right, I know what's probably going on here, whatever. And my poor wife, she's like, we can't go this way. I'm like, well, we have to go this way. And, I know what's going on here. I've encountered this. They just walk by, like, they're not going to do anything. Like, and she's like, I almost had to, like, carry her out. I'm like, they're not. I'm like, he heard us coming, and that's why he jumped out. So we're walking by, and it was one of the more comical scenes I have ever encountered out in the field. And you had the guy that was there, and he had jumped out off the trail, and he's sitting on this big boulder, all folded up, looking away. You can't see anything. He's wearing socks, but, you just see his back. And then there's another guy on the opposite side of the boulder looking in the opposite direction, like they don't know one another. Like these just two random, naked guys just enjoying, like, the scenery. And it's funny. And I thought, like, maybe I should mention that only 100 feet away there's a rattlesnake, but I don't want to draw attention to that. Or maybe I should warn them about all the ticks. This is just not really good.
They're not dressed appropriately for rattlesnakes or ticks, it sounds like.
Yeah, so that's like an example of one of the stories, one of the more, human encounter type things. And I know a lot of people out in the field, whether it's hunters or people looking for whatever, reptile or other animals, encounter odd things in the woods, never a dead body. I don't want that, but like, it's just, so yeah. I kind of, it incorporates that. And of course, sometimes with law enforcement too, and that. But again, that was years ago. That was all worked out. But when I was new on the scene, biologists and other officials were, "Who's this guy?" And then once they kind of figured me out, it's all kosher now, more or less. So I don't focus on that too much either. But it was part of the story. It was part of my story in the beginning of diving deep into timber rattlesnakes, and it's not just going out in the woods trying to find these animals. You're dealing with, again, the incident in the Blue Hills. You're dealing with some officials. You're dealing with other people out there searching for these animals from, all walks of life. So I kind of incorporate a lot of that into it. And a couple other chapters focus more on the biology of the animal, but a lot of them are first encounters, and I include a couple outside of New England. My first diamondback, for an example, that I felt like that was interesting because I had almost stepped on it. I had searched all day, in the generic, where you're in Florida, where snakes are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And coming from New England, I'm just walking in this sea of palmetto, saw palmetto. Snakes are everywhere. And they're nowhere and everywhere. And spending 6 hours, I'm not finding anything, and walking back to the car and seeing a southern black racer and going, wow, there's something. I'm going to capture this. And this is in February, so any snake's exciting. And I'm chasing this southern black racer, and I'm reaching down to grab it, and my foot is about to plant on like a 5.5-foot monster diamondback. And in fact, if that racer was just over a few more inches, the way the saw palmetto was, I wouldn't have seen that part of the snake. So if it had moved over, I explain it more articulately in the book, but I would have stepped on the snake. So all day wishing for a snake, and then there's two, and then the harmless black racer almost causes me to step on a monster eastern diamondback. So it's along those type of storylines, like the first time, interesting encounter, with human interactions of all sorts. So I try to make it interesting, and I try to, and for my goal was to interest other people besides just herpers. So, and I think I succeeded in that. It's a human story as much as it is a venomous snake story. And of course, I include other species like hognose and box turtles. So,
yeah. Well, that's great. Well, we'll include that, like I said, in the show notes, so everybody can have a look at that and purchase one if they're interested.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a quick break and tell you that the Orianne Society is dedicated to protecting some of North America's most at-risk species and their habitats, like eastern indigo snakes in the longleaf savannas, eastern hellbenders in the Appalachian highlands, and wood turtles in the great northern forests. Healthy ecosystems depend on these incredible animals, but these landscapes and species need our help to survive. If you care about reptiles, amphibians, and the wild places they call home, visit www.orianne.org to learn more about our work and how you can get involved.
Let's talk about how the photography eventually kind of spun into other technologies, and I'd like to start with the videography and the trail cameras. And I mentioned in the intro, this is one of the things that really made me first take note of the work you were doing. And maybe start off by just kind of telling us about that discovery. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, but what you've been finding with these weasels and rattlesnakes, and then let's talk about trail cameras in general, and just kind of your trials and tribulations and what you've learned and all of that as well.
but with trail cameras, it was literally a light bulb going off. One day I just sort of like my book it was in the background interest, but it was a switch. And the technology was improving too, and trail cameras are just not that. I'm like, out of all the thousands of dollars I spend, a trail camera is 50, 80. Some of the better ones are a couple $100. Now, of course, it's a higher risk because you're leaving the equipment out in the field. But I was very interested, and this was the goal I actually had set out. I want to record interactions between timber rattlesnakes and other wildlife, whether that was a predator-prey relationship or some very comical ones, black bears, like walking over them, a black bear actually sniffing a rattlesnake, not knowing it was a snake, and then jumping back out of the scene, and the snake didn't even care. So that was my goal, and I had thought, if I'm lucky, the most likely scenario will be a red-tailed hawk preying on young timber rattlesnakes, maybe at a birthing rookery. So that was my goal, and for the first 6 months or so, I just practiced with them more locally with other wildlife, mammals, and I wasn't really sure how reliable the technology was going to work with ectotherms, even though it's more of a movement sensor. So if you want to get into the weasels now, and that's the pinnacle of everything I've ever recorded, and it is truly an astounding discovery. And inadvertently. So I've been setting trail cameras up at Hibernacula in New York, in part for the ingress-egress cycles, which we recorded that and kind of what you would expect. I'm seeing them in person anyway, but it's neat to actually be viewing them when no humans are present. And we record other interesting interactions with just the number of rodents, for an example, that take up residence in Hibernacula, even when the snakes are active, but the snakes are not feeding, or if they're brumating. But that was one of the first interesting things I noticed, were the number of rodents, and in many cases walking by over the snakes, gray squirrels, for an example. But this is when the snakes are settling down, especially in their feeding response. And at one site, I just kept the cameras up there just because I just couldn't get out there to retrieve it. And This was like 5 years or 6 years ago, and it's a little cave structure. And I thought it was neat, like, wow, all this other wildlife going into this cave. Bobcats, young black bears, raccoons fighting one another. I'm like, oh, this is kind of neat. Like, what happens at a rattlesnake den during the winter months? And just something different, a little video I put together. So I left it there the following winter. And I started to leave them at a couple other sites to record any winter basking. And I ended up recording, the cameras captured quite a few incidences of snakes, and not necessarily ill-looking snakes, basking throughout the winter, and not even on the most mild winter days. So initially it was inadvertently, but yet I left some there the following winter to record any winter basking. And then just one day, I went to go get them in December, or get the memory card. I come home, and again, a lot of these clips, it's just leaves blowing, a raccoon walking by, going into like the little. It was the first of the little cave structure, and I was sitting at the computer. Usually, I get home late. Still get home late. It's not as much of a big deal now because the kids get home late. They're teenagers. And I'm drinking a glass of wine, and I'm going through the footage, and I just could not believe what I observed on that footage of a long-tailed weasel. The clip starts with, so it's a small cave structure which leads to crevices that ultimately go back even further, where the snakes go back by November, even further back. This snake being dragged out by the neck, so you can see the first third of the snake, and like it's a dog pulling on a rope, twisting and yanking an adult rattlesnake out of one of the crevices in the back of the cave. It falls to the floor of the cave. The weasel pauses, picks up the snake, which appears to be lifeless at this point, walks up to the trail camera, drops the snake right in front of the trail camera, and then again takes like another breath. It's about a 30 to 36 inch rattlesnake, so an adult, a breeding adult size, and picks the snake up by the neck and then drags it off film. And I think it was a 20-second clip, and the clip ended 1 second after you see the rattle of the snake being pulled out of the left part of the frame. And I had no reaction, really, to be honest. Did I just see that? And fast forward now a few years, it's now been several incidences, and at 2 different den sites, and we're talking several different weasels. So at this first site, I was just... So it was in November, and there was 2 predations by 2 different weasels, and I know it was 2 different weasels because the first predation, the long-tailed weasel had a white fur coat. And so at mid-latitudes, long-tailed weasels, not all of them change their fur coat to white in the winter. It's kind of based on genetics, and those genetics are ultimately based on its mid-latitude. A lot of winters, especially in recent decades, you don't get as much snow. So the further north you get, more long-tailed weasels turn white. By the time you get to the southeast, no long-tailed weasels turn white. Not to confuse this with the short-tailed weasel, or the ermine, now has been renamed the American weasel, but they all turn. Their fur coat turns white. So this November long-tailed weasel had the classic, snow white fur, and then in February, a brown weasel. And then during this time, the cameras were recording the weasels going in and out all winter long. At least those 2, brown and white, brown and white, brown and white. And they are... So the year before, when I had mentioned, the raccoon's going in there, this is kind of neat, a bobcat, I'd get the weasels too. And I even had a weasel just after it had caught a white-footed mouse. So mentioning, or what I had mentioned a few minutes ago, all of the white or the rodent activity, the mice activity. There's also shrews and voles. That their top prey, long-tailed weasels, are rodents. So I think they're attracted to the hibernacula because of all the rodent activity, and that they're hunting for these animals pretty deep inside the den structure, and then come across some of these rattlesnakes and dispatch them inside the den or while they're dragging them out. I have one recording. This one's really disturbing. If you're a fan of snakes, like most of the people listening to this, this is at a second hibernaculum. A white-furred, long-tailed weasel in the middle of winter, I think it was February, pulling out an adult rattlesnake, and it was still moving and rattling, and it dragged it out into some pretty deep snow and then dropped it. And it was really cold too. I think it was in the upper teens, around 20 degrees. And this snake tries to crawl through the snow back into the den, and it doesn't make it. And the weasel comes back and drags it out again, and that's when the clip had ended. And in the next clip, it comes back with no snake, but you can see the drag marks of the snake as it was presumably dragged down slope from the den. And I have another one. This is a comical one. This just happened last year. The clip starts pretty early in November, where I was surprised that the snakes would be pretty warm still at that, maybe body temperature of 60. And the clip starts where you can see the weasel inside the outer opening, struggling to get this rattlesnake out. And you can hear the rattlesnake rattling, and he's struggling and struggling and struggling. And on the right frame, Mr. Raccoon enters the scene. But what the weasel hears, or maybe it knows it's a raccoon, it hears something approaching the den. It drops the rattlesnake and runs out of the den, trying to get away from this potential threat, and doesn't know, watching the clip, it apparently didn't know exactly where this potential threat, the footsteps, were coming from. It runs out of the den, nearly collides with the raccoon, inches. It scares it even more, really startles it, and then the weasel takes this huge leap and lands on the trail camera, which was positioned on the ground. This is all comical, but unfortunately it knocked the camera down. And the raccoon just doesn't care. He's just like, what just happened? And then that's an issue with setting some of these trail cameras up, is they get knocked down, they get buried in snow, they're triggered hundreds if not thousands of times because of vegetation, leaf litter. So in recent years, I've been visiting one of my favorite rattlesnake areas out in New York during the off season, during the inactive season, to just monitor these cameras, because my sole focus regarding trail cameras, especially now, is this weasel predation. And I am surprised that other researchers are not really focusing on this, because it's an unknown. Nobody knew that this was happening. The prey is weasels are normally prey for rattlesnakes, and this is learned behavior. So during high rattlesnake activity, guess what? There's no weasels around. Like, they know through scent and just instinct, previous encounters, that these are dangerous animals. So it's learned behavior that they recognize that these snakes are basically defenseless when they're chilled down. But you still see them kind of nervous when they're pulling out the rattlesnake, especially that one in the snow. Like, it knew that once it got it outside, that the snake would become even more lethargic. So the question is, and of course, after I started posting this initially, all these horrible stories about weasels and how they go into overkill mode, and that it is true. It's documented, although in many cases that's in captive situations, or livestock, chickens, and so I never had thought that, and I was like, what are the chances that I just stumbled upon these first time just the one-off, or that this just weasel just figured it out and he's just going to go in there and wipe this den out during the winter, which just hasn't happened. So this has been likely going on, of course, for centuries, for thousands of years. And I think that they are primarily there hunting for rodents and are still a little nervous with the rattlesnakes. But some have learned that, and I think, again, this is all in my opinion, that these snakes that they're they're following in mice. And these snakes are kind of, nobody knows exactly how a den structure looks inside, whether it's just one chamber, multiple chambers. But it's unlikely that the weasel's climbing over many other rattlesnakes and then decides, oh, I'm going to take one of these. I think it encounters one kind of on the edge of its search area where it's hunting these rodents, and it becomes opportunistic to grab some of these snakes and pull them out. But I think with large populations or healthy metapopulations, it is part of their mortality, but it's just long after I'm gone. Like, this should be, I hope I'm thanked 100 years from now, because this is like 100 years of research and non-invasive research. Like, what we could learn this winter if you had 1,000 trail cameras set up at, a couple hundred dens from Massachusetts to North Georgia, and then just monitor, just have, go out there a couple times during the winter to collect that footage. Maybe there's next to nothing. But what are the odds that out of 2 dens that I've had 3 predations, 1 attempt because of that raccoon encounter, and this is just after a couple of years, and then at other den sites I have set them up. Weasels are going in and out all the time, but no recording or captures of weasel predations. And in addition, some of these dens, you need multiple cameras set up. There's multiple entrances and exits at these sites. It's what we could learn if we set up cameras at multiple sites across their range, and how that might tie into very small isolated dens in New Hampshire, which cannot lose, the loss of one adult female, an unnatural, or this is natural mortality, but something that can be managed, humane trapping of the local weasels in the area. But when you have a population of just a couple dozen animals isolated, and a weasel's taking one every other winter, that's the end of the population right there. So is this a case where weasels just in that area, some weasels don't, that learned behavior is not passed down, and in other areas it is? These are all unknowns that will take decades and decades, many thousands of hours of research, but it's there. The technology there is there. It's very tangible technology. You have the camera, you have the recording. It's non-invasive, and an extension of that. I'm surprised, people that study these mustelids are not interested in. It's unknown to these weasel researchers too. And
but that's what I was going to ask you: is how have these been received by multiple demographics? Meaning, let's just say snake enthusiasts. Agency people who are working to manage and conserve these, more academic scientists. Like, how have people received these videos you've been putting out?
I still think it's early days, and I actually will be writing a scientific note next year on this phenomenon. And I expected more feedback regarding this. I think for a lot of people that, for me, it's just, it's a life history event. It's an unknown life history event. But if you are an amateur enthusiast of rattlesnakes, you don't want to watch that. You don't want to think about that. And I think for state biologists, it's I don't know. I've had other people reach out to me, but it's never. I'd say after all of these years is one of the more surprising aspects to studying these animals, is uncovering an unknown life history event. I mean, been studying timber, not me personally, but for decades, and we've learned a lot, and we know a lot of their life history. This is, maybe it's not huge, but it should be studied extensively. This is, if not just to incorporate it as part of their life history. And let's be fair, like give so many researchers and college students like incredible research opportunities to set up these cameras over a period of years. I mean, what are the chances that it's just these two random dens in New York that this is happening? And it just started a couple of years after I've been setting them up. And I thought that, well, maybe the first time it was a one-off. It's not a one-off. We're talking 3 or 4 weasels at 2 different den sites. And I have just started this at a few den sites, times that by thousands of den sites, say, over the next 50 years. The only notable thing is if you go on like AI and you type in, do long-tailed weasels prey on timber rattlesnakes, it's all my stuff that comes up. And I would encourage other, researchers or amateurs to really get involved. Like, I only have 2 or 3 decades left in my life. Like, this should be something that's just passed along, if not just for the fascinating aspect of it, but the more serious conservation aspect of it. So maybe the den in New Hampshire, for an example, maybe for 10, 15 years, there's no weasels that have been preying on rattlesnakes. But then you get that one weasel that passes it down to some of their offspring. And yeah, if you have, like one of the ridges I visited in New York, probably has close to 1,000 rattlesnake, many dens, overlapping dens, the classic population distribution. So if 50 are dragged out of their dens every winter, it's probably been a big deal. It's right. But I am so surprised by this. And I had thought other people would be like, oh, this is already known. People know that but I have heard of incidences where people have found predated rattlesnakes in early spring, chunks of their midsection. And those are probably weasels. It's the only predator that can squeeze into any area that an adult rattlesnake can squeeze into. And it's part of their mortality so far at these 2 den sites. And I thought that people would be reaching out. People reach out to me all the time, but not on this specific topic. That it's the one that I really want to talk about, because it's not about me or even just the snakes. It's about research and learning this fascinating, completely by mistake. I'll just say that this is probably one of the biggest, or it could be through more studies, not just involving me, one of the most significant timber rattlesnake discovery, or even herpetofauna in the Northeast, to say, in decades. And little credit to me. I have this technology, the logistics and the hiking and visiting a rattlesnake, hiking through snow. Like, it just doesn't seem like, why would you do that? But this is how I spend a majority of my time now in these rattlesnake areas, is setting up trail cameras, freezing my butt off, doing this. But I think it's important, and I want others to incorporate this.
Yeah, I think it's really important because just a timber rattlesnake's life history is built for longevity, and a female to replace herself in the breeding population potentially needs to live, who knows, maybe 40, 50 more years. So anything with animals like that, a lot of turtles are like that as well, anything that causes adult mortality can very quickly change the trajectory of population. So even if those weasels, you mentioned 30 or 40, that's huge. But even if a weasel that happened to eat 4 adult females in a given winter, that could have a huge impact
Yes,
on that
exactly.
population. And so I do think it has the potential to be really important, and I think it's amazing, your story, your interest in these animals, and your interest in the technology and documenting it, and how it's all coming together for something that I think could be very valuable
And just
for
to
the
add
future
to that,
of these animals.
real quick, is there's always this impression that, excluding snake fungal disease, but once the snakes are in there, these timber rattlesnakes are tucked away in their hibernacula, they're safe.
Yeah.
So I've always have got this picture of biologists throughout the East writing their reports all winter long. Like it's, the snakes are hibernating, they're in their dens. We'll, re-kick the new research in April and May, that there is a potential, and I'm just throwing out a random number out there, but as these biologists are writing up their reports and their documentation, that from New Hampshire, hopefully not New Hampshire, but from New Hampshire to Georgia, or North Georgia, there could be hundreds or 1,000 rattlesnakes that are being dragged out of their dens by these small mustelids, and nobody had any idea, including myself.
Yep.
So
yeah, it's
hopefully,
amazing. Well, we do need to kind of wrap it up. We've been going well over an hour now. So, but that is, I think, a great take home message: the importance of the use of this technology to document this life history, natural history occurrence, and that cry that we need to learn more, because it could have important implications for these populations. So I think that's a good place to wrap this one up. But before we close down, I do like to have all of my guests tell me a snake story. So Mark, what's your best snake story?
well, one of the more entertaining ones that could have ended a little worse, but one thing we didn't focus on is just how passive timber rattlesnakes are for human encounters, that a lot of folks that fear these animals or have little experience, again, the whole persecution for centuries, and that's a whole nother, but we didn't really bring that up, and this little interaction kind of sums up sometimes when we let our guard down, but thankfully you gotta always be cautious, but sometimes it's very difficult for years and years and years hiking through rattlesnake country. You try to always be, responsible and respectful of the animals, and just keep an eye of your surroundings. But I think a lot of people may not have this similar story, but you need to respect the animals. But thankfully, we're all human and we make mistakes. And gratefully, these wild animals are rarely defensive. And that's what the buzzing of the rattle is, and camouflage. So one time I was at this is years ago, I was at one of my favorite birthing rookeries, and it was a hot summer day, and the snakes were deep under the cap rocks, the slabs of granite, and there just wasn't great photo opportunities. But, I spent all this money on this equipment, and it's a challenge. So even on a day where the snakes are deep under rocks, or the contrast is terrible, I'm like, well, this is why I have an external flash with a cable on it. So there was a couple of really nice yellow morph timber rattlesnakes, gravid females, and I'm like, well, this is the only picture I'm going to get, so let's just try to get it right. So snakes tucked deep underneath there, and I have the external flash out, and I'm taking pictures, and I would sit on that rock, so I'd crouch down, take several pictures, get up back off the ground, sit on the rock, and kind of review the images on the display, cursing, oh, the flash is too bright, it's creating too much of a shadow behind the snake's head. Why don't I reduce the flash, do it this angle? And so I did this a couple cycles, down. And while I was sitting on the rock, I had the camera low only a few inches up off the ground because there was a little bit of shade. I needed the shade to look at the display. And I have the camera tilted downward just above the rock. And, there's insects everywhere. So I kept feeling this ant crawling on my hand. And I kept kind of just brushing it away, like not really thinking about it, almost subconsciously. And I'm reviewing some more images. And then I feel it again. And it's like, I thought I brushed that ant off. I looked down, and that female had crawled partly out of the rock, total investigative curious mode, and what I was feeling was her tongue licking the back of my hand. And this had gone on, again, it happened a couple of times, so she had licked it for several seconds the first time, but I don't think she'd retreated back under the rock, because it was just a few seconds later I felt it again. And all the experience of the rattlesnakes, you don't jerk, you don't move. This is the one time it was so shocking and unexpected that I jerked my hand back, and of course she just thankfully retreated. But I've experienced that a lot with these animals. They a lot of times will crawl out to investigate, and they'll figure it out. They usually figure it out pretty quick, like, oh, large mammal, potential threat, I'm backing off. And I was surprised that this one, the scent alone was like, no, I really got to get a more accurate scent. Let me actually have my tongue rub against the surface of this mammal to really get a total big picture of what we're dealing with here.
That's amazing story. Amazing. Yeah, I've had multiple stories. Probably like you. I've had tens of thousands of experiences with rattlesnakes and venomous snakes in the wild. I've never had a bite, but I've had many stories like you're talking about, like the closest calls you can imagine. But as you mentioned, the snakes by nature pretty docile. I almost feel like to truly get a bite, you need to like step on one. Or
I know.
Really put your hand heavily down on one or something like that.
Yes, another story, I won't get into it, but basically I had tripped over a rattlesnake that was hidden in dense grass. I actually fell to the ground. I tripped over it. It didn't get injured. The terrain itself wasn't that, it was like thick grass, so I was sort of already tripping anyway. I think it was asleep. The snake was asleep. It woke up, and we were both, what the heck just happened here?
Yeah, that's amazing. Great. Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on. I've enjoyed it. We'll put some various things in the show notes, probably a link to one of the Weasel videos and a link to the book and some other things. So people should be able to find all of that. But again, thank you for coming on the podcast.
I really appreciate it, Chris. This was a good time, and that was one of the quickest hours I've had in a long time. I could talk all day about some of these fascinating animals and other stories, that so many more that we don't have time to get to, but maybe some future podcast or out in the field sometime would be great.
Yeah, that would be great. And if you want to hear more of Mark's stories, make sure you pick up his book. And I just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember, snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.